Welcome everyone. Today we have another new episodes, and this episode actually we're going to discuss about good health and well-beings. We have our expert panelists, and already I declared those who joined today. Uh, we invite them in our World Talent Economy Forums, our board of advisors. So already Professor Donalds, Mr. Robs, as well as Professor Edwards. We are planning to move with lot of intellectual activities in Asia Pacific. We are developing summit, conference, different kind of academic activities. So your contributions in World Talent Economy Forums is very, very helpful, especially for our youth community, those who are always getting lot of good content from World Talent Economy Forums. So I want to start from Professor Donalds, then Mr. Rob and Mr. Edward. How do you want to share your views, especially on good health and well-being? And if you share your experience about vaccine and these things, maybe it will be helpful for our Asia Pacific community. Professor Donald.
Okay, well, I'll start a little bit with the vaccine, which is, there's not a huge amount to say about it because I think most people, my personal experience is I got my first shot and made my arm a little sore, but I'm very relieved. I am extremely relieved to not have to worry or know that in another couple of weeks I won't have to worry about getting COVID. I still wear my mask. I still do everything because there's no one knows 100% if there's some way that I could still be contagious. But I think you'll all find. Sharif told me that you just started getting the vaccines in Malaysia. And yeah. I'm sure everyone is going to be so happy and so relieved. It's a great thing. I think that the thing about health and well-being, we talked about it before, and we talked about the how health problems that we don't really have a lot of in the United States, like malaria and cholera and dysentery and all these and parasites of various sorts, tapeworms, all these different kinds of things really, really are drags on the economies of a lot of the developing nations. We talk a lot in this show about unbridled growth. I mean, when people are having too many children, that and populations increasing, it puts a huge amount of stress on the environment and makes it difficult to basically develop a standard of living that's really good for everybody. And it's well known that as economic growth, as the economy gets better, as people are better off, the number of children they have goes down. So in the developed world, Europe, United States, and places like that, the birth rates are so low that when I lived in Finland, they'd literally pay people to have children because they didn't want. And some countries have been benefited greatly by Middle Eastern immigrants who've come to make their populations more stable. Anyway, that's kind of a different topic, but the point of the matter is that for the developing nations, having better health is going to be the main key for them to become stable so that they can start doing well and having a good quality of life for everybody. And then I want to just say one other thing, and then I really am interested in hearing what everybody else has to say, is that this is health and well-being. We're mentioning this. Well-being is a little bit nebulous, but when I think of it as health, having enough to live on. People don't. After a certain point, except with some exceptions, people really don't care about money. As long as they have enough, they usually have other things that interest them. I mean, there's always misers and crazy people that all they care about is money. But then there's another aspect to well-being, which is psychological. And in fact, one of my Japanese students was talking about a book he just read where they found out that the most productive teams and organizations, the ones that are the most creative, have a sense of psychological safety. They feel that
Mhm.
if they say something, it'll be accepted, even if it's stupid. And that's how creativity works, is you have to try things. You have to try a lot of things. And if somebody shuts you down every single solitary time they don't agree with you, you don't have psychological safety. But then psychological safety expands into the larger environment that you're in. If people don't wear masks, it's scary these days. If your government is unstable and you don't know for sure that your money that you have in the bank is going to be there in 5 years, all of these kinds of things wind up. If you have debtors' prisons, you're not going to want to start a company that might actually fail. So there's all these ways that we can be psychologically more safe. And I'll finish by saying that the happiest countries are the Nordic countries. So Finland
Mhm.
wins. It's the happiest country in the world for 3 years in a row. And if you go to Finland, it's geographically that beautiful. They don't have resources. What is it that makes them happy and comfortable? I can't necessarily answer it, but it these things become a model for everyone else in the world, and they've got good health care, social security, they have psychological safety. And I think besides cleaning up our environment, we also need to find ways of thinking about measuring psychological safety and other psychological factors and incorporating them into the goals of nations and companies and us as individuals.
Thank you, Professor Donald. Mr. Rob.
Well, health and well-being is an interesting topic because a lot of things are relative. If we were to go back to the Middle Ages, the definition of health and well-being would probably be living to 38 and having all your limbs. That certainly changed over time. Over the years, we've conquered a number of the illnesses like polio, only to find that people take the vaccines for granted and they start to come back. So in the end, it does require kind of a consistent mindset. Donald pointed out, one of the things that's often forgotten, which is mental health. And mental health has been one of the biggest problems to look at during the pandemic, because we took people and we isolated, particularly kids, and we isolated them during the time when they're typically most social. And so it's having some significant impact. There's actually some indication that we're actually changing our brains yet again. In fact, it's kind of surprising to me how many things we do that rewire our brains. Pornography, video games, the kind of things we watch on TV and how we interact all have an impact on how we think and how we interact with the world. And so we desperately need, as we move through this next age of technology, an ability to actually measure some of these changes and if needed, undo them. Here in the United States, one of the big changes that's been accelerated by the pandemic is the spread and acceptance of conspiracy theories and incredibly unbelievable not news stories. And it's causing a socio-political problem in the country that's severe. These are all things that can be measured. These are all things that can be mitigated. But for the most part, whether we're talking about the developing or the developed world, we're not doing that work. And so we have the unintended consequences of the pandemic making a major change in how we think and work. And we really don't have our arms around it. And we're faced with a number of other critical problems we also have to get our arms around. Global warming being one of the biggest. But the other thing is the very likely sequential appearance of additional pandemics coming from practices that we should be avoiding anyway, like taking lots of animals from different species and putting them together in very inhumane ways, which is what's causing these diseases to jump from species to species and eventually to humans. So we're not really thinking through this underlying problem. We're not metering it properly, and we're not applying our knowledge because we're not identifying the problem well. We're not applying our knowledge well to address it. And so that's what I think is the biggest problem we're facing. We have the capability to get ahead of this. We've got the capability to make for a better world, to make for a happier world, but we're not really applying the resources that we have to assure that outcome.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Professor Edward, how do you want to introduce these good health and well-being issues?
Well, I'll start off since Don started by talking about getting his vaccine. I have not received mine yet. I'm here in the United States, in the state of Maryland. And the reason I haven't, I think, is instructive for healthcare and well-being in the future. We have a Food and Drug Administration in this country that has to certify as both safe and efficacious any kind of medication, vaccine, medical device, etc., that's offered to patients. The problem is that the system was set up in 1962. It's a bureaucracy of about 15,000 people. It takes 10 to 12 years at a cost of about $3 billion to get a new product from lab to market, in part because of the way this antiquated system is set up. What's interesting is, for example, I'm in Rockville, Maryland. About 4 or 5 miles from me is the headquarters of AstraZeneca, which produces a vaccine that's been used by about 1 million people in the UK and in many European countries. Now, there's still tests being done to see how effective it is for people over 65. We know that for people under 65, it's almost 100% effective, keeping them from dying or going into the hospital. So you would think that this would be released immediately in this country. In Baltimore, Maryland, which is just up the road from me, about 30 miles, there is a manufacturing facility that makes the AstraZeneca vaccine, and it's sitting up there right now. And there are hundreds of thousands of people in the state of Maryland who can't get a vaccine because of the shortages, because the Food and Drug Administration has been sitting on this vaccine. The lesson I want to say here is that we have, certainly in the developed countries, and certainly in the United States, bureaucracies that go back for decades that simply are not functional given new exponential technology. They're simply not relevant. I'll give you another example here, that in August of 2019, our Food and Drug Administration put out a request for input on how to regulate artificial intelligence as a medical device, as if it were a heart valve. You say, wait a minute, artificial intelligence applied to medicine? That's not a medical device. Well, they have the authority to regulate medical devices, so they've decided it's a medical device, and you see the problem here. What I'm suggesting for your audience is that they think innovatively, that they look beyond the ways of the past that have been used to, for example, certify new medications. There are better ways of doing it, in fact, with artificial intelligence, where you can run tests, on a computer, so to speak, with real world data input that can get, determine what's effective, what's not effective, and individualize it to each individual, not just to say in 73% of people it works, but to individualize it to you. Let me say another quick point here about population and well-being. Don makes a very good point that as life expectancy grows, people have less children, because if you're not worried about half of your children dying, then instead of having 12 children, you can have 6 children or 3 children. Some are going to survive. In 1970, we had a global population of 3.5 million. Many people predicted we're going to have a catastrophe. We're not going to be able to feed the people. A guy named Paul Ehrlich, who was a famous writer on the population bomb, said we're all going to be having hundreds of thousands of bodies in the streets. We have a population of about 7.5 billion today. We produce more food than ever. We're generally more prosperous than ever. Don's point is well taken, but I think the key here is that in a system that has certain amount of individual liberty and freedom and property rights and so forth, and it gets beyond the corruption that you see in African places like that, then you have prosperity, you have more stuff being produced. Well-being is the final thing I'll mention, because this is indeed, as the others have commented on, a very important point. And it really does come down to a number of issues, and especially the idea of you as an individual and everybody in the future with exponential technology have to start thinking of themselves not as I'm just a worker or I'm just a whatever. You are the entrepreneur of your own life. You are the investor in your own skills. You are the manager of your own time. We have to get this notion of personal efficacy is very, very important. One of the things you see in inner cities in the United States, and I've done work in Africa and in other places, you see a problem with where it's basically taught impotence, where people just don't see how they can affect their world. Part of it is the political system when you have a corrupt system, but it's also a mindset. And for well-being, to really have well-being, you have to be an achiever. You have to be able to reflect upon yourself and say, I've controlled my own life. I'm producing, and whether it's a new enterprise, I'm being a good farmer, I'm being a good parent, and whatever. That sort of thing does produce a sense of well-being and a sense of excitement in your own life. And so these are really very, very important issue. It's a mindset. You know, again, I'm sorry for going on a little bit long here. I'm an American. I come from an immigrant background. My mother's family came from Italy. My wife's family came from what was then Palestine, is now Israel, because the family was wiped out in Germany and managed to get over here. I can talk about other parts of my family that are immigrants. We came to the United States because we had opportunity, because we could be efficacious and have a sense of well-being, because we could make our own lives. So I think that's essential. And I think you're going to see that spreading throughout the world. The more economies free up, the more we get rid of the corruption that I think we all agree is a terrible thing holding people back. And in the end, healthcare and well-being will improve.
Thank you, Professor. Professor Donalds and Mr. Rob. Professor Edward come with some of the interesting strategy and informations and point. So how do you want to analyze, and how do you want to give feedbacks, and how we can develop better?
There's something that others brought up, and I want to mention right at first, which is the issue of misinformation and disinformation. All of the world that's external to us, like Kuala Lumpur. What do I know about Kuala Lumpur? When I met you, I thought to myself, well, I don't know very much about the place. So I read the Wikipedia entry on it, and the Wikipedia entry has links to other things that I could read on it. So I read about it, and now I know something about it. That's something that we can all do ourselves, where there's information that's available. Wikipedia is actually pretty good. I wouldn't take it as the final word, but it does have usually links to sources that are extremely credible. And anyway, I'll just mention that. I had an interesting, I'm not disagreeing with what Edward says. Okay, I want to put this out in the first place. But I had an amazing experience. I was sitting in a pub in Palo Alto, and I get talking to the guy next to me. And I said, what do you do? And he says, well, I'm the drug company person for my giant drug company that I work for that interfaces with the FDA. And my immediate reaction was like Edward, saying, oh my God, it must be a nightmare working with this horrible bureaucracy. And he said, no, that's not true. They are very, very, very good at what they do. They're dedicated public servants. We're very lucky that they exist. And I want to just point out that understanding the probabilities is extremely difficult. I found the certain kinds of statistics very, very difficult. And I still make mistakes. I mean, some of the papers I publish or peer review do have statistical things in them. And it's still so easy for me to be tricked by something that looks really good. But actually, if you get into the really analyze it, you find out that they've made mistakes and you can't trust what they say. Right now, we don't know if any of the vaccines prevent the spread of COVID. And we don't know that if a person is vaccinated, that you can be sure that you're not going to get COVID from that person for any of the vaccines. And in the past, we always did the extra step where we could answer questions like that. So the only way that you can, literally the only way, there's one way that you can do statistical analysis to find out if something works or not. And that's double-blind studies. That's it. There's no other way. Population studies are always subject to independent variables that we just might not know, and those kinds of studies are complicated and expensive. Like, we can't do them anymore because so many people been vaccinated. Now we can't be sure that we can get a control group. And so the reason that it takes so much time to do these kinds of things is that it really, to actually do it correctly is a challenge. So it may be that part of it is the bureaucracy, and I think that there's more understanding because the kind of drugs that we're making now, we're identifying the place in the RNA in the virus that we can target, and then just using CRISPR and just making something that genetically modified organisms that can. And we can do that so quickly that the first target vaccine, the first vaccine candidate for COVID was made in, catch this, 3 hours. 3 hours. And so we still have the statistical issues of asking the question if is it safe? Does it work? What does it actually do when you get it? And those are time-consuming and difficult questions to answer. So we do need to have more of a balance. There's variants of COVID now, and the drug companies are saying that they can come up with vaccines for the variants like pretty much instantly, and that they don't have to go through the same rigorous testing process that they had to do with the initial vaccine. So we're going to find it's an interesting issue. So yeah, I'll pass it on.
Yeah, I just want to make a quick comment here. I know people who work at the FDA. I've been to their last 3 annual conferences. So certainly a lot of the people there are very dedicated. And again, I've sat with them and discussed with them. And so it's not really a matter of whether the people are well-meaning. I certainly grant that. Part of the problem is that you have a system of incentives where, for example, if one person has an adverse reaction from some product, which of course happens because we're all individuals, then a lot of members of Congress will start beating up on the FDA. Why did you let this thing out? But what the current system fails to do is recognize the invisible graveyard that occurs because something is held back. And I'll give you an example. In the 1990s, at the height of the AIDS epidemic, something like 50,000 Americans were dying each year from AIDS. That's as many people as Americans were killed in the Vietnam War. What happened was our Food and Drug Administration, under pressure from Congress, created what's called a parallel track, where a product that had been determined to be safe and there'd been maybe a test or two to show its efficacy could be accessed by individuals before the FDA completed the certification process. Something like 12,000 people during the 3 years it was still in the clinical trials were able to access that product and have their lives saved. So what I'm suggesting, and the other thing is this, and I posted the link to a paper where exponential technology is showing that there are alternatives to that can either complement or in some cases even replace the current clinical trial approach for a lot of treatments, not fully. But again, you can look at the academic journals that basically say that so-called gold standard. It's not that it's worthless by any means. It's just saying that technology is here that can speed things up, that can, for example, determine endpoints and then just look for those endpoints. And we won't go into a lot of the details here. But what I'm saying is that we have to look closely at the current system, because again, we've had we look at the literally 500,000 Americans who've died from the virus. A lot of people would probably want to roll the dice if they saw that the AstraZeneca vaccine, that's literally sitting in a warehouse right up the road from me. If I had access to that one, because I know that it's useful for people in my situation, I'd roll the dice and get it today. But I cannot get a shot in the state of Maryland right now anywhere. And so that's the problem I'm looking at. And again, what I'm suggesting is that other countries, try to take a look at the long-term and exponential technology and see how they can complement current systems and maybe even leapfrog current systems so that we're all healthier in the future. We can get these cures out there quicker. That's what I'm suggesting, not that we get rid of standards.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Rob, as Mr. Edwards come up with a different strategy, especially vaccine approval for FDA approval and this issue, what your opinion on that particular issues, and especially if you have a different kind of strategy for good health and well-being?
Well, I think we should be taking a data-driven approach to most everything. Edward pointed out that there are better ways to do studies that can speed those studies out. But we have a distinct lack of data use in the medical community. You would think it would be otherwise. And the difficulty is, and we saw this recently because IBM this last week announced that they're going to be exiting the healthcare industry with Watson, $1 billion business for them that is unprofitable. And the reason it's unprofitable is the lack of data sharing. We have these huge data repositories that exist in colleges and universities that do healthcare research and study hospitals that do research, but they don't share them. And the data types are very different from institution to institution. There are ways now to match the data types, but then you run into a problem with regard to regulation, because the data itself is highly protected against sharing. Now, there are ways to get around that as well. And then you run into what is really the core problem, is that these folks don't really want to share. A hospital or facility that is an expert at treating one particular disease uses that as a competitive advantage, and they don't necessarily want to share that information with another healthcare organization that might make better use of it. And this lack of data sharing has caused just a huge problem, such a big problem that IBM is backing away from the industry entirely. And what makes this kind of painful to watch is I was there at the birth of Watson, and Watson was initially targeted at healthcare. And the story that I was told by the lead physician on the team was that he'd had a 2-year experience as he was a young medical practitioner. He'd run into a woman who had been suffering for years from an undiagnosed disease that was exceedingly painful and driving her toward suicide. And nobody could come up with what it was. And so he spent 2 years working with her, researching it, and finally found it was a legitimate disease, not well known. And they were able to diagnose and deliver a cure. And now she's fine. When Watson was created, Watson Health was created still in prototype form. They put her symptoms into the system, and it listed 10 possible diseases. One of them was the one that she had, cutting down the diagnosis time and the time to treatment from 7-8 years to more like 7 or 8 days, and so a huge potential benefit. And then if you think of the overall application of this, particularly as people are remote, you could have a situation where somebody remote in their home could be scanned, could articulate what it was they were feeling, and then Watson would put out a list of 10 things that were likely, and then the health practitioner could work through and find that thing and get them cured without ever having to go into the hospital. So which is what we don't really want people doing right now because of the pandemic. we look at Bill Gates. The bill started talking about the pandemic as being a risk back in 2012, I believe, and then highlighted it again in 2017. And then when the pandemic hit, if you remember what happened, people started talking about the fact that, well, he predicted this thing, he must have caused it. And so rather than looking at what he did and say, hey, how next time do we take this kind of advice and apply it timely so we prevent the next pandemic? What we did as a society, or at least a lot of people in society, is we attacked the guy that came up not only with the disease, with the plan, but with a plan to mitigate it before we even had the disease, instead of taking this as a learning moment and using it to make sure we prevented the next pandemic. And there's going to be another pandemic. We even know the cause. I mean, the funny thing about Bill's prediction back in 2012, he not only predicted we're going to have a pandemic, he predicted where it was going to originate and why. And the thing is it originated just the way he said, and it likely originated how he said, from the animals that were kept in close proximity and under stress. So diseases were jumping from species to species and likely jump to humans. And yet the markets that created that in the region where it was created have not been shut down. The animals are still abused. They're still kept in close proximity. And it's very likely we're going to have another pandemic and probably even going to come out of that region. Here in Oregon, we came to the conclusion that behavior was bad. And think about this for a minute, folks. The behavior we're talking about is taking animals and abusing them to a degree that we reduce their immune system so that diseases pass from them to us. So not only are we doing something incredibly bad by abusing these animals, but it's causing us to die, and yet still we continue to do it. And so we here in Oregon, we've shut down the mink farms because it was another class of animals. And geez, minks are incredibly cute. I mean, as I look at these minks and go, how are we? I mean, anyway, but that's what you have to do. You have to get ahead of the problem, but you can only get ahead of the problem if you analyze it, if you treat the people that have pointed out the problem ahead of time respectfully and learn from them, so the next disease can be identified ahead of time, and so that you can have the cures in place when the diseases show up. But if we attack the people that warn us about the problem, then we're blind and dumb every time a problem comes in. And then we have here in the United States the 500,000 people that have currently died, most of which were avoidable deaths. I'm flummoxed, because even with that example, we are still not implementing what we need to have implemented to keep this from happening again. One other thing just to query on, we lose 60,000 people to the flu, up to 60,000 people to the flu every year. We could reduce that dramatically just by wearing masks. We're wearing masks now. All we have to do is not stop wearing masks. And when we're in public, and we could reduce the amount of death by up to 60,000 people for just the flu. Forget the pandemic and other diseases. I mean, less colds. Colds are almost non-existent this winter because people are wearing masks. Yet, do we want to wear a mask? I was just on a post the other day that said, one woman said, my mother's never going to wear a mask because it's going to smudge your makeup. Well, would you rather smudge your makeup or spend a day in bed sick or maybe dead? Yet, it would seem to be an easy decision, yet we can't come down to it. So the final thing is it comes down to education. I honestly think we need to start educating people when they're young about the idea of good health practices, and those health practices have to sustain throughout their lives. And then we can reduce dramatically the amount of sickness that is spread person to person. And then back, and I'll close one more comment on the Watson thing. The one thing about Watson, now that they're getting out of healthcare, that was forgotten, is Watson was expected to reduce healthcare costs by more than a third, probably substantially more than a third if it was implemented. So you'd say, well, the government's complaining about the overall cost of healthcare. Our government's trying to put in a program called Medicare for All, so people are covered like other developed countries for medical. You would think the first step, and that was our prior president's mistake, would be to reduce the cost of healthcare first before taking that step. And we can do it. Yet almost no focus on reducing the cost of healthcare, almost all focus on turning it over to government, while it is still too costly to afford. And that's one of the reasons why this stuff keeps failing. So we really need a programmatic approach to healthcare and well-being. And I'm afraid it's going to have to start from the bottom, because it's not starting from the top.
Yes, I think Professor Edward want to add some point.
Yeah, I mean, these are very good points, and I agree especially about education. One of the problems in this country, by the way, is that the most of the healthcare costs come to an individual when they're older. Young people don't get as sick as much. We all know this. Both of my parents are 89 years old, and they're in an assisted living facility. My dad has been in and out of the hospital for literally the last year. He actually had COVID and somehow managed to survive, at 89 years old. So we're all very happy about that. My mother has Alzheimer's, and that's unfortunate right now, is incurable. But the point, we have a Medicare and Medicaid system in this country that is so convoluted that there really isn't an incentive. For me, for example, my incentive is I have two 10-year-old daughters, and plus I love life. So I want to live long, and I want to see my daughters grow up and do cool things and all. So I have a great incentive to take care of my health and jog every day and eat well and so forth. But wouldn't it be great to have a system in which, for example, insurance, instead of having a sick care system in which insurance kicks in once you're sick, and once you've got your health screwed up, wouldn't it be a good system if, in fact, you were encouraged to take care of yourself, and maybe you put higher premiums on people who, right now in this country, in the United States, if you smoke, you pay higher premiums, okay? Because everyone knows smoking is a factor that causes all sorts of health problems. But I think you really have to look at a system of incentives in this country and elsewhere as well to have people incentivized to stay healthy. And I posted something here, and I think, Rob, you mentioned, and this has come from the conversation, right now, wearable diagnostics really offer an opportunity that instead of having the annual doctor visit, you have it right there. You're being monitored potentially in real time. An Aura Ring right now is a product that monitors sleep for people who have sleep issues. But with wearable diagnostics and having your own genome sequenced and knowing exactly what risks you have, wearable diagnostics would mean that if I'm about to have a heart attack and there's precursor indicators of a heart attack, the medics would be at my door before I even have it. And so that's the potential that exponential technology can have. But I think what we have to do is take a really deep look at the current systems, certainly in the United States and elsewhere, to make sure people are incentivized to take care of their own health, and so that I, trying to be very healthy, don't have to pay incredibly high insurance premiums to support all of the other folks out there who are, overweight, who are eating poorly, and so on and so forth. So, and I completely agree with Rob about education and consciousness raising. After all, if we all love life, you do in Malaysia, you do in the United States, you do in the UK, you do in Japan, you do in China, you do in all of these places. If we all love life, shouldn't protecting our own lives and our own well-being and health be job one? Because if we don't have that, we can't do all the other cool things. I want to terraform Mars. I want to see my daughters do that, and so they're going to have to live long, healthy lives in order to do that. So I think we're all in agreement here, and I think what we have to do is look at the current systems to see where they're failing, where the disincentives are, and then start working towards the change.
Thank you, Professor Donald. Yes, unmute, please, Professor.
The points that people are bringing up are all very useful points. What happened in the United States is that hospitals were one of the first things to computerize. They did it very, very early. And the way that they did it is every single solitary hospital that could afford it hired somebody to come in and set up a system for them. And what that consequence of that is it's extremely difficult to share data because the data is not in the same format. They didn't design it to be able to transfer the data from one place to another, and they're retrofitting it now and have been for years. But it's still, and a story about that is when I was living, my thesis advisor and friend, Harri Kukanen in Finland, did very well because what he did was developed middleware that allowed the hospitals in Finland to exchange data. And in Finland, where they have a centralized healthcare system, they still have horrible problems being able to transfer data from one computer, one system to another. So it's an extremely difficult problem. And I totally agree that the big data that big data and various kinds of ways of analyzing it can give us information that's so useful that we could depend on it. In the end, no matter what we do, it's probabilities. Even our knowledge of physics goes down to probabilities. So we can't say something's 100% true. It's just not possible. So the point is that we can reach a threshold of probability that that makes it reasonable for us to act. And right now, the only way that we can get that threshold of probability is double-blind studies. However, it's conceivably possible with the degree of, if we had the degree of data that the others are talking about, that we could find other methods to reach a statistical threshold that's as useful as that. I just want to say one other thing to pass it on is that to emphasize how incredibly difficult it is. So I have a friend who works at Stanford, and her job is to show that a certain gene expresses a certain trait. And that seems like, okay, well, that's, so that would be straightforward. And we'd go out to dinner like once a month, and she'd tell me what she was doing at Stanford. And she said one day, she said, well, I worked for the last 6 months on this Bayesian algorithm to do this and that and the other thing so that we could be able to show that this particular gene was expressing this particular trait. And she said, it didn't work. She says, and I love my job because I went to my boss and told her what I did. And she said, well, you did the right thing. I'm glad I didn't have to go through all that trouble. But just things that I also worked for a while at a company that did credit card validation. So when you put in your credit card, there's a signal that goes back to a central data center and asks the question, is this potentially fraudulent? So they did it for big companies, Bank of America, Barclays, and that is incredibly difficult and fraught with peril. Even with everything that they could do and all the knowledge, there's still plenty of mistakes. There's times when people's credit cards are rejected that are ridiculous. So being able to compute these probabilities is an extremely, extremely difficult job. If people are starting from scratch, like countries like Bangladesh and that don't really have a strong infrastructure, having some sort of centralized idea of what you're going to do in the first place, of how you're going to share data, would actually cause the country to be able to almost leap ahead of the United States the way so many developing countries leaped ahead of the United States in phone technology because they didn't have wired infrastructure. They started out with cell phones. And so things like M-Pesa came around, and incredible uses of cell phones that we just don't have because it took us, we were very slow in adopting cell phones because like I go to Finland and everybody had cell phones. I come to the United States, you wouldn't see them at all. And that was because we already had an existing infrastructure and it was very difficult to switch. So that's something. And if you're an individual student, you can study this stuff. I mean, data communication is around. There's big data databases. Learn how the various kinds of systems work, and learn how to learn the algorithms. Learn how to make algorithms, and then learn the algorithms that people are using to do the analysis now. So that's an exciting area to be in too. very exciting. So that's what I need to say right now.
Yes, Professor Edward. Yes,
Yeah,
I think you want to.
yeah, these are very good points. One thing I want to say about data, because I completely agree about this. One of the ideas that I've been promoting, and you can see it in the link to my website, is a free to choose medicine approach, which essentially builds on the approach that was used to allow AIDS sufferers in 1992 and after to access medications that were still in clinical trials. And the idea is this. Of course, you mentioned clinical trials, and of course you have a certain number of people in a placebo group, a certain number of people in another group, and they're limited, right? We have this group that has men 30 to 40, or this group that has women, 40 to 50, or whatever. And that's how you do clinical trials. Well, here's a thought experiment. If you're studying a tiger, where do you learn more about the tiger? In a cage or in the wild? And obviously the answer is in the wild. So what about a system where you set up a parallel track where a drug sponsor can put a medication that's past FDA, that's past safety trials, and maybe one or two efficacy trials, and essentially open it up to anybody who wants to try that product in consultation, of course, with a physician. That way you have real world data coming in. But the key is this: anyone who accesses a promising medication for Alzheimer's or for whatever it is, they have to post that data and information and experience in an open database that researchers can consult, and that other patients can consult. So if I say, oh, I have a particular problem, I can go to that database with my physician and say, it looks like this one is very interesting. That would mean also, with real world data flowing in addition to the data from the clinical trial groups, products that don't work very well could fail much quicker and be flushed out of the system. So you basically have an incentive for companies to put that information in a database that can be accessed by people. You have the opportunity for people to choose to try this because they can't wait for an Alzheimer's cure because there hasn't been a new treatment for 23 years. And so it's kind of a way to transition to a system where real world data is incentivized for companies to get the product out there to see if it can either succeed or fail quicker, and to get that real world data that we can all use. And that's one that I've been playing around with. You can look at the materials on my website that I think is a very promising approach.
Thank you. Mr. Edward. Rob, sorry.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, so let me try a little bit different direction. If we look at the medical establishment, the incentives are upside down. That if you take a look at the flu, the flu business, it's a massive business. Companies make billions of dollars on flu remedies. If they were to develop a flu cure, a flu vaccine that had the same kind of efficacy that the coronavirus vaccine does, because if you think about it, they're very different approaches to a vaccine. The flu vaccine is developed to target very specific variants of the flu, and if you don't, and if you get a different variant, it doesn't work. The coronavirus vaccine is designed to target the areas that the virus attacks and blocks those areas. It's kind of the difference between having an anti-missile system that's able to shoot down just specific missiles and having a force shield that can block all missiles. Now, we don't know for sure if that force shield is going to handle every single variant, but it handles an impressive number of variants. So far, they're claiming that the COVID antiviruses will handle all the variants that have so far come up. Now, you would say, well, why don't we use that same approach for a flu vaccine? Well, the reason is the financial incentives aren't in line with that kind of approach. If we were to cure cancer, the overall income of the health industry would drop precipitously. Their financial incentives are not focused on curing cancer. Their financial incentives are focused on mitigating cancer, which creates a fairly significant problem if you want to be well. That means that we need to adjust the incentive system so that the incentives support the behavior that you want. That's the role of government. Industry is not going to do that. Industry is never going to act against its own self-interest, regardless of any Hippocratic oath or other area of responsibility. Yes, some doctors would absolutely trade off income for doing the right thing, but the pharmaceutical industry, probably not. In fact, we've had people running the pharmaceutical industry that were obviously psychopaths. One of them is in jail right now for just going kind of crazy with regard to drug prices, and not only that, kind of crazy with regard to investment, which will put him in jail. But the fact of the matter is, if we really want people to get better, we need to change the incentive system so it incentivizes cures and de-incentivizes, or at least reduces the incentive for offsetting medications, so that those medications, the practice of coming up with mitigating medications, isn't financially incented over the practice of inventing cures. And so until we fix that, we're probably not going to have a lot of the cures we're hoping for. The cure of cancer, which is a leading cause of death. In fact, what really surprises me is we don't commonly know what the leading causes of death are for humans. It's worth looking up, because if you really wanted to talk about health and well-being, you'd start at the top of that list. And you'd work down. I mean, but we don't. It's a shotgun approach. Whatever is getting the media at the moment, we focus on that like cats in a bright light, and we forget about everything else. But instead, we ought to say, okay, maybe this thing that's killing 3 or 4 or 5 million people a year every friggin' year should be our top priority. And if you think about it, we all die from old age. How much effort is actually going into lengthening our life? There is certainly a lot of research, but given the fact that old age has 100%, there we go, the 100% chance of killing you, you would think that would be a far higher priority, but the economics of caring for old people is massive. And so the financial incentive for curing death is reduced. Plus, of course, we have those other issues like overpopulation that would immediately kick in if we did. But they're all addressable. But if the goal is to save lives, then we should prioritize our effort where it's going to do the most good, and that means we go after the things that kill the most people. We were having some argument in my community a while back about autonomous cars. And the concerns about autonomous cars and the fact they're going to take away freedom and your ability to drive. Except when you look at the massive number of people that die in car accidents every year, more than 30,000 people in the United States alone. You say, well, it would stop those. I mean, those people that lost wives, children, whatever. You drop it by 98% with autonomous cars, and yet we can't seem to grasp that maybe keeping that child alive is more important than being able to go on a sporting drive in the afternoon. Our goals, our personal priorities are flipped, and so that takes us back to education. I think back at the beginning of this, we really need to take a much better effort of educating kids to prioritize, to approach problems programmatically and scientifically, and try to solve them, and really teach ethics so that they understand that getting paid for suffering, regardless of how lucrative it is a bad thing. I mean, I'm still struggling with this fact that we can't even come to the conclusion that maybe taking a whole bunch of animals and torturing them as an industry is a bad thing that's killing us. I mean, it's one of the things that cured me from really wanting to eat meat as much as just going to a slaughterhouse once and saying how the hell that's done. Not a ton of fun. And yet we now have technology that we can actually make beef without killing a single cow. And we're fighting that technology rather than embracing and accelerating it. So it's a case of education. It's a case of reaffirming priorities that will help the race survive. And we are fundamentally letting our race down by not doing this and doing it early. We don't even have a decent set of consistent classes teaching kids how to live as they come up through education, let alone how to behave ethically and responsibly in their lifetime. And we desperately need those because we don't have the right priorities. And the only way to fix that is to start training people on what the priorities should be.
Thank you.
Rob, this is a very good point. I want to give you a little story here. In the late 1990s, I was working for the Cato Institute, which is a libertarian think tank in the United States.
I know.
I was trying to get together a conference on FDA reform and future medicine. What's interesting is that I went to some of the big pharmaceutical companies, and except for one of them, they all said, well, Ed, we agree that there should be some reforms, but they never supported the effort.
Oh.
And part of the reason I think is, and I have lots of evidence of this, is that the big pharmaceutical companies can absorb a lot of regulatory costs. A small innovative company cannot. So if you're a big pharmaceutical company, then you don't mind a certain amount of regulation because it keeps your competitors out. And so I'm a hardcore free market advocate, but free markets mean that you don't use a government system to beat up on your competitors. And so if you can produce, and I mean, after all, look, the fact that we're having this conversation, the fact that that 70% of Americans now have smartphones that weren't around 12 or 13 years ago, that competition created incentives for, the technology that we're using literally right now to have this discussion. But we don't have those kind of incentives in the current system. So I agree with you completely about the need to look at those incentives. And I came up against this, as I say myself, when I was trying to get together a conference 20 years ago to have exactly the discussion we're having now.
Yeah, it's not easy.
Yes, but one specific point when we discuss about free market, and we are thinking like sometimes government create a lot of challenges and control over society, so we need to move. But even in COVID situation, we are observing different developing nations, those who actually distributing vaccine, only one companies. Example, in Bangladesh, only one companies, and who is getting this business actually? Who is actually Prime Minister advisor, chief advisor. So I welcome him in World Talent Economy Forum. So now even vaccine is fully politicized, and government has full control over this vaccine, and it's a business.
The UN has been outspoken about the fact that if not everybody's vaccinated, then everybody's exposed, but the UN, I think we've mentioned this in prior shows, just doesn't have the authority to drive change. That they just lack that capability of forcing people to behave properly, and as a result, the wealthiest nations are able to buy the resources, and the poorest nations can't get access to them, which is problematic because with people's ability to travel globally, if anybody's sick, everybody's sick, and none of these antiviruses are 100% effective. They range from 75% to 95%. What you forget is that when you're talking about world population, those small percentages are still huge numbers, and it makes it very difficult to get to any kind of herd immunity, which is a number of attempts to get to herd immunity that sound to me be a bit crazy, like get everybody sick, and that's the way you're going to get there. But in the end, if you want to really stop this thing, that's what you have to accomplish. Everybody's got to get the virus. Now, some countries are donating. New Zealand took their extra viruses and donated to the poor countries, recognizing that. But New Zealand's a pretty small country. They can't make a difference. But even if the U.S. were to do that, even with their size, they're not big and powerful enough to drive it across the world. It really would require a world effort. And the lack of the capability for a world organization to drive a world event is going to be problematic long term. Whether we're talking about healthcare, whether we're talking about the proliferation of world-ending weapons, whether we're talking about global warming, all of those things require a planet-wide effort to be effective. The Paris Accord was a mistake on two fronts. One is it had no teeth, and even Paris isn't in compliance. And the other is it actually set up people against complying rather than driving compliance. And so we really have to get back to thinking through, if you want to solve a problem, focusing on the solution and not focusing on the politics of who's better, who's worse, and my country's going to do it and your country's not. The I've got it and you don't kind of mentality. These world problems require world solutions, and that means we're all in this together. And until we get to a point where the world realizes that, or where we have a power like the UN that has teeth, I'm not convinced we can make the progress we need on any of these major events.
But
Yes.
the one concern I would have, by the way, is that I don't trust international organizations. Some are good, some are horrible. Because
Exactly.
I've worked with UN development, and their work has been horrible in many cases, and so that's something I'm concerned about as well. I think the education point you make is right on the mark. But for example, if you talk about the Paris Accords, the United States has reduced its now I'm not as concerned about carbon emissions, but the U.S. has reduced its carbon emissions by 14% in the last 2 decades, thanks to fracking, because natural gas burns much cleaner than a lot of the alternative fuels. Without Paris, on the other hand, China during that same period of time has increased its carbon output by more than what the U.S. produces in 1 year. So anyway, my concern is that I agree with you on the importance of looking at these things globally. I'm just a little bit standoffish on giving a lot of the international planning organizations that kind of authority. I think that your point about education is right on the mark.
Mm-hmm. And beside that, I want to add few points. Yes.
Oh, wait, my point on authority though is if you want authority, because I agree with you with regard to China. China's disappointment. I was living in California, and for a long time, most of our smog was imported from China. It was because we kind of fixed our smog problem, and that turned out the source of the smog was coming from overseas. But the only way to fix that is for some kind of overriding entity to force China to comply. Now, giving China a lot of grief, I should point out though that China's probably done more in terms of offsetting their problem more recently than any other country. They've turned vast wastelands into forests of late. I mean, it's pretty impressive the way that country has stepped up in the last 5 years to address the problem. But it's still one country at a time, and often then you get one country that's clean, and then another country goes off the rails with regard to pollution. You're still screwed. I'm not aware of a way to here in the United States. If you get a company that misacts, you have a regulatory organization that steps on them and brings them back into line, and that seems to be the only way to do it. If you full free market, you often result in you get mega corporations that wipe out all their competition, and then you need a government, a similar entity, to step in and remove them, because the mega corporation is simply going to misact, and it's just the way things seem to happen.
Unfortunately, what the mega corporation unfortunately does is it takes political power and goes after its and that to me is the problem.
Example, yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes,
Hey,
Professor Donald. Yes, Professor Donald, I think.
Well, you know that one of my things is about how narratives and the stories that we live in create our reality. And so education is it's a general term that encompasses a lot of different things. One of the things that people often champion is the idea of rational thinking and critical thinking. And that's, again, a general category, because critical thinking in one situation may not work in a different situation. The thing that concerns me the most, and I actually been reading some papers on this that just came out, they're just being peer reviewed for a conference, about how incredibly difficult it is to identify misinformation and disinformation. And Finland has sort of inoculated their population against misinformation, disinformation. It was just in the papers. They are especially targeted to it because they're next to Russia, and they've always had kind of an interesting relationship with Russia. At one point, Finland made its living being a middleman to Russia, because the Western world wouldn't exchange with Russia. So anything that Russia got from the Western world or sold to the Western world came through Finland. Not everything, but a significant amount. And what the Finns the Finns did is they started teaching school children how to recognize misinformation. Unfortunately, in the United States, there's been a deliberate effort to destroy the institutions. And some of the institutions are government. There's been a hardcore, deliberate effort. And the way that it's been done is by just questioning their veracity. So, for instance, I say, well, I saw this in Science or Nature when I subscribe to those, or New England Journal of Medicine. I subscribe to that too. And I know the effort that is made being able to check an article in those papers, because I've done peer review. I do peer review. And for those that don't know, I should tell you, because a lot of people actually have a complete mis idea of what it is. Or basically, we get enough. I've arranged for it too. You get authorities in the subject, and you get the papers, and the papers don't have the author's name on them. There's no way that you can tell who the author is. In fact, you check it. I check it before I send it out, and I say, well, there's this part in here where you actually talk about yourself and talk about what you do, and I say you have to take that out, because it would bias people if they don't like you or they do like you. I have to read them first and make sure that there's nothing like that in it before I send them out. And so and no science, it's not something that a scientist, like, there's accusations that scientists just go along with everyone else, and they do to some degree, because you can't really get a paper published if it's too off the wall. You need to, what is it somebody said, extraordinary events take extraordinary evidence. And so that's basically the issue here. So what I'm trying to say is that there's quality of stuff, information. And if a scientist gets caught faking information, they're doomed. I mean, that's the end of them. So there's a strong incentive for scientists to be able to present their evidence in the most compelling and well-researched way that they possibly can. And scientists aren't the people don't go into science to get rich. I mean, some people wind up doing something that does make them a lot of money, but that's minuscule, 1/100%. So you can learn, like, the systems, and it's the same with the top newspapers, the New York Times, the Washington Post. If somebody gets caught faking something in those papers, the papers apologize, they explain that this was a mistake, they do everything that they can to correct the mistake, and that person who faked it is doomed. That's the end of them. And again, people don't go into journalism for the money. They go into, so there are better and worse sources of information. And then the second part is, how do you evaluate that information? People build on these core sources of information, journals, scientific journals, and they make the assumption that the information's in it is accurate. So they build on it. They say, well, given that this is true, I suspect that this other thing is true, and therefore I am going to study this other thing and find out whether the evidence is for it or not. And so if you read that second thing, you need to be able to have some sort of a way that you can decide if this person's arguments are correct. So what I do when I do peer reviews, I go back and I read the original papers that they referred to if I haven't read them already, and then I'll go back and read the papers that those papers refer to, and go through this whole system, make sure that the person understood it, that the person is using correct statistical methods, and various kinds of things to do what I can to make sure that that paper is accurate. And that thing, anyone can do that. People send me stuff, and the first thing I do is go to the references. I don't even read it. I go to the references, and if there's no references that I feel comfortable with, I don't bother. I don't want to read it because it'll put garbage in my head, and I don't want garbage in my head. And so that's what Finland did. And as I say, another part of evaluating it is being able to learn enough statistics and statistical methods to be able to answer the question. I just put a link in the private chat to a book, and there's many books on this, that the placebo effect actually makes people better. It actually will change your neurochemicals. If you believe that something's going to cure you, in many cases, in a stunning amount of cases, in fact, the woman who wrote the book said that she keeps big blue pills and big red pills that are sugar pills in her cabinet. And if she has a headache, she takes a blue pill. And if she has something else, she takes a red pill. Because even if you know it's a placebo, it will it can affect your health. So that's the reason that it's very, very difficult to decide if a drug works or not. Because even if you're giving them a sugar pill, in many cases, they'll get better. Mm-hmm. And so we can't. I mean, that's the underlying problem. It's a very difficult problem to solve. And so the question and the methods. So basically, what I'm saying is, you need to be able to learn to look at something and say, well, I don't believe it because you haven't done the kinds of things that are necessary to convince me that it's true. And as a rule of thumb, I just don't believe anything when I first hear it. I mean, that's a good rule of thumb. And they've accused liberal professors of brainwashing people, but I have a good friend who's a Stanford sociology professor, and he does the same thing. He tries to teach people not to believe anything that they read and learn how to develop the arguments so that they can understand the probabilities. Because ultimately, we just have probabilities. So I'm finished now.
Don, your points are very well taken. And I've got a science background myself. And so I'm very concerned about these things, about critical thinking. And I do fact checking for papers, at least when the previous jobs I've been, I've had to go through and say to authors, I need a citation for this. I need to go over your data myself. My concern is that science has become politicized. And I see it more from the left than the right, though both sides, I think, are guilty. And I just posted a link where the Board of Education of the state of Oregon is offering to train teachers about how math is white supremacist and racist. I put the link in there, and you can actually go and read the quotes from, this is a news story, but you can go through to the course itself. And I could spend the rest of the show posting links to this sort of incredible postmodernist nonsense. I'm hoping that all of us are on this call and our listeners are in what I would call the Enlightenment tradition. I don't mean that as a Western European thing. I mean that as that there's an objective reality, that we work towards it through analytics, through looking at the evidence, parsing the data, all of these kinds of things. There's a postmodernist philosophy that rejects that idea. I hope these people are not designing aircraft and medicines, but I want to point out that to me, that is an existential danger, that more and more in leadership positions, you have people indoctrinated in that perspective. And if anyone's interested, I can give you more and more and more citations, but it's something that's it's something I'm very concerned about because I see it more and more and more. And somebody who I started as a high school intern working at NASA Goddard on the Apollo 11 moon landing. I was just a little geek, so all I could do is run around and do errands. But I mean, my interest in science and technology goes back that far. So I'm very concerned when I see this sort of thing coming up. So I just want to warn, I hope that your listeners in Asia are immune from not only the virus, but this even worse virus, this virus of the mind, this virus of philosophy.
Thank you. Mr. Rob.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, it's kind of an interesting concept. About the I've been watching a series of memes flow through social media over the last week, going back to Reverend Sun Moon, who wiped out his entire following as part of a crazy cult thing, and just reminding us that these cults can form and people believe these bizarre things, and then you have these extinction events where they're dead, and you go, how can
They
people
won the Darwin Award.
Yeah, well, the Darwin Awards. That's actually a web. There's a website on that is fascinating to go to and terribly sad about the stuff that people believe. And we had a story here the other day that some woman had become convinced that drinking urine was going to prevent her from getting COVID-19, and had been feeding her children urine for several days. And the idea that it was going to be a cure, and let's be clear, urine does not cure COVID-19, or prevent you from getting it. We even had a president that kind of suggested you could ingest bleach or somehow get infrared light inside your body, something that would kill organic matter inside your body to kill the virus. Now, he was right. Injecting bleach and using the light would kill the virus. It'd kill you too. So anything that kills you could pretty much kill the virus. It's just not a path to wellness that I think I'd want to take. So in the end, it's this misinformation that's become this massive problem. And we often point to social media as the source, and very realistically it is. And the problem with social media is the same problem I brought up with regard to pharmaceutical companies, is the incentives are upside down. Social media, as it was formed as a free service, which decoupled the users of the product from the revenue that the product received. And so you've got advertisers that pay for the service and users that use the service, and that means the users become the product. Now when you become the product, you become a thing, and you can sacrifice a thing for revenue. Well, we do it all the time. We sacrifice trees to build homes. We sacrifice natural resources to build factories and the things we build in factories. When you make people into the product, you sacrifice them to make revenue, and that in and of itself should be an incentive system that we discourage. Because I don't know about you, but I don't want to be sacrificed so somebody else makes money. Dead is kind of dead. So in the end, it still comes back in my mind to core education. We need to treat people to prioritize things better. Donald pointed out that there's a certain need to teach people how to do critical thinking and understand statistics. In my business as an analyst, we have a saying called "lies, damn lies," and statistics. And if you understand how statistics work, you can read them and you can determine what you need from those statistics, both the efficacy of the statistics and the and how to use them. But if you don't, people can throw numbers at you and can convince you of anything at any time. I remember sitting down with a major vendor that I was working with at the time, and they were talking about the fact that they were giving away a product for free, and they decided to discontinue giving away the product for free because customers didn't want it for free anymore. And I said, well, that makes no sense. Why would somebody not want a free product anymore? We said, well, we sat down with those customers. And we said, we're going to give them the product for free, but if any of their employees copied that product, we were going to sue them. And they said, well, we don't want to be sued. And so we said, well, that means you don't want the product for free. That was one hell of a friggin' step. And it was perfectly logical for them to make that conclusion based on the data they received by corrupting the output because there was not really but throughout my life as an analyst, I've run into this repeatedly where people will take what looks like a logical progression and come out with the wrong outcome. There's an old joke about a frog with 4 legs, and that where the scientists are working and they say, okay, they measure the frog, and the frog jumps with 4 legs, 4 feet, and then they cut off one leg. It's kind of cruel. And then the frog jumps 3 feet, and then they cut off another leg, one leg left. The frog jumps 1 foot, and they cut off the last leg, and the frog doesn't jump, and they conclude the frog has gone deaf. but it's funny, but we do this stuff all the time, and the fact is if you don't understand the basics of statistics, how statistics can be used, the importance of the validity of the data that you're using to reach the conclusion, and to make sure the conclusion follows the evidence and isn't a sidestep, those are all important and relatively simple lessons to teach. But if you don't teach them, then people don't understand that they're being fooled. And here in the United States, and I think in most of the world right now, we have an overabundance of bad scientific information, and no ability at the grassroots level to make those determinations. Which means most folks listen to somebody else's analysis of the data that they're seeing, and then they believe that is as a fact. Whether it's the world's flat, which is, I don't know how you sustain that. Or many of the other crazy things like drinking urine or injecting bleach or using a drug that doesn't work as the drug that does work. All these things happened in the last, there's the smartphone. All these things happened over just in the last few months, and yet we haven't made a major effort to fix the underlying problem, which is killing us at the moment, because the anti-vaxxers, the anti-maskers, the folks that are going around, at least in this country, talking about the need for personal weaponry. They're all, in most cases, it's all very poorly founded. And the screwy thing is most of these people could actually get what they wanted, what they truly wanted, whether that be or a better tax system or even better personal protection, if they just went back to the facts and built from the facts a solution that fit what it was they wanted to do. But we don't do that. People don't understand the facts. They listen to somebody else interpret the facts for them, and then they believe that's gospel, and that's a huge problem. And you had something you wanted to say.
Yeah, Rob, this is a very good point. And to Sharif and to your other listeners, I would add this. As you look at your education systems, one of the problems we have in this country is, for example, pardon me for doing this, my little 10-year-old daughters, aren't they cute? Both study math in school. And the way they teach math, and this is Montgomery County, it's a prosperous county, one of them pretty much follows it and the other doesn't, because they teach it in this very weird, convoluted way. Right. And so I spend every evening usually with the one daughter who is not very good in the new convoluted ways. But here's the thing. Instead of the curriculum that's, that we have traditionally, wouldn't it be better to teach, starting at least in junior high school, if not earlier, statistics? How many people actually use, calculus if you're not going to be an engineer? Why are you studying that in high school? Shouldn't you be studying these more basic things that you're going to use for life instead of the stuff that is in curriculum because you have institutional interest in, we have to get the textbooks in there, and you have textbook companies that sell textbooks for $100 and disincentives, instead of teaching, for example, what would really be valuable for my little daughters here, and that is teaching statistics beyond sort of the basics for math. So everyone listening in Asia, take note of this. Don't copy the American system to the extent that it just does this, okay? You give them something useful.
The funny thing is that, and we look at education in general this way, is everybody seems to get, the education system seems to be set up, and honestly, a lot of businesses set up with the idea that everybody is the same. So the same education program for Bill is the program that Steve gets, the program that Steve gets, Betty gets. And doesn't work. In my own experience, when I first started out with calculus, I was always an A student in math, and I had calculus and I bounced. I just bounced. Theoretical calculus, first F in math I had ever received in my life, and I was depressed after it was all over. Then I switched over and I took practical calculus, applied calculus, a second highest grade in the class, because I could see what I could do with it, and I realized that classes about mathematical theory weren't interesting to me because I couldn't see how I could use it. But give me a class in math where I could apply the math, and it was fascinating because I was solving problems that I could wrap my head around and make use of. Now, other people are wired differently, but this pandemic where we've got kids learning remotely does provide the opportunity of creating curriculum that is much more targeted because everybody's not in the same room. And so you could design a curriculum that specifically targets the interests, strengths, and weaknesses of the student. and deliver it that way with teacher oversight. Take the negative of not being able to have everybody together in the community and turn it into a positive with more targeted learning and carry it forward that way. Now, there are efforts of the Lenovo subsidiary Land School is trying to go down that particular route at the moment. But this idea of take this as an opportunity to relook at education and then optimize it for kids learning remotely with the understanding that we're going to have other pandemics. There are going to be other events. Hell, we have snow days, even if we don't have pandemics, where kids at home where they could get customized tutoring and training to address their specific needs during that time, because they're not in the classroom. It's very hard to do customized teaching when everybody's in the same room. It's a lot easier if you can separate them out into their own virtual rooms and do it that way. And so there's a huge opportunity in the emerging countries that are dealing with this issue to do something very different than the developed countries and actually create a higher grade of citizen, one more resistant to the problems that the developed countries are having and much more capable of carrying their country forward into the next stage.
Right. I can't wait for Sharif's next show, which is going to be on education reform.
Yeah. Definitely. As I'm also from education industry, I just want to share some point, like example for education. It's my understanding, because we develop some big education groups in Bangladesh, even in Malaysia, I have engagement. So like students, when they develop any projects or anything, that time I think they get more learning, they have different idea and they involve with this project in a proper way. But if we go with too much of theories and the books and the case study, this is different things. And culture also depend. I don't know, when I teach the European student, they are very much of discipline. Indians students, they are very hardworking, and Chinese students, they are very good in math, geometry, and they love to sell. From the young age, they love to sell. Maybe there are different cultures. So this is, yes, definitely we're going to discuss about the education. This is very important. But from the developing nations, I want to add, I'm not lucky like Professor Edwards. I lose my father in very young age because I cannot manage a intensive care unit for my father's intensive care. This is the problem of developing nations. Still, I think that we have to go a long way. We have to develop our research centers. What you are discussing, I think, country like Bangladesh, country like Indonesia, country like Vietnam, country like Pakistan, they have to develop more research center. They have to invest on research. So people like you, those who are highly capable and those who have enough interest on research and development, maybe we can develop a bridging in between developing nations and developed nation. This is important. And COVID actually teach us that we need to develop our healthcare system. Still, we need more doctors, more nurses, and most important thing is that we need to solve our corruption related problem. I want to say developing nations, they have money. I do not want to say they should depend right now for the developed nation for donation or anything, but unfortunately political corruption play a major role. Yes. And that's why still there are a lot of challenge. And even with this COVID, there are even the vaccine and other thing, there are still the political issues. So we have to overcome from these things. So thank you for today's sessions. I want to go for the concluding remarks. I want to start with Professor Donalds, then Mr. Rob, and finally Professor Edward.
Well, I think that we all basically came to the same conclusion, which is that that an informed population can lead to better decisions. Since this is an audience of individuals listening to it, I'm going to make some recommendations about things that you can personally do. I do want to make one side note, which is that Finland has one of the best educational systems in the world. Their kids do some of the best in math and all the different tests. And their educational system is guided by research in learning. And the United States educational system is guided by, this is the way we've always done it, and so we have to keep doing it that way. I heard all these horrible things about Common Core where people were just flipping out about it. And so I looked into it, And the way that they teach multiplication is so much better than the way I learned it. I switched. I'm doing what they suggest. So there's some sort of thing in the United States where we know better ways, we know different ways to do it, but we just don't do it. There's inertia. That there's a very strong conservative, and conservative just means, you know, that they want to keep the same values and same social structure. So that can be an issue. I think that Edward said this right at the beginning, which is that in the end, you have to be the entrepreneur for your own life. And whether or not you are independent and you work outside the system and create a company and things like that, or you work inside the system, you can, they call them entrepreneurs, people that within a company that come up with new ideas and new ways of doing things. And you're going to encounter that inertia that I just talked about. I mean, you're going to find people that just say, this is the way we do it. We don't care that you have a better way to do it. We agree it's a better way, but the ability to change the social structure is low. And I think that what everybody said about trying to learn statistics, there's a good book called How to Lie with Statistics, which is a good beginning book. There's quite a few very, very good introductory books that you don't really have to get into the math. They explain what it's all about. And I am philosophically a philosophical pragmatist, which is different than pragmatists, than the common view. You know, something pragmatic in the lay term just means something that's practical. But philosophical pragmatism has the view that truth is something that we iterate towards. And one of the founders of pragmatism, or actually the founder, Charles Sanders Peirce, was an amazing logician. He's the person that came up with blind randomized trials, among other things. And he said he invented the idea of fallibilism. Its term actually had been around since Greek times. And the idea is that no matter what we know and how carefully we measure something, we can have better measuring tools in the future, better ways of doing things, and we can change our view. So how do you live in a world where everything is changeable? So there is no real truth per se. There's no absolute truth. How do you live in a world like that? Well, the answer is ultimately you have to start understanding probability, because there's some things that are so probable that it's ridiculous not to consider them true in facts, like entropy. And however, you have to also understand that it's possible that we will revisit this at some point from new things that we've learned about quantum physics and things like that. So the understanding how probability works. In fact, I looked at the link that Edward and I went to the actual paper that Fox News quotes. Fox News is a very unreliable source, and it didn't say anything like what the article said. It was completely different. And so I think that that's a really important thing to do, is just don't believe anything. Go and read the original source, see what the person actually said. And it may not be deliberate. It may be that the person just didn't understand it and they're telling you what they think it meant. So don't trust anything completely, because in the end, it's all probabilities.
Thank you, Mr. Rob.
Well, it comes down, I think, in my mind, if we're going to go back to the topic of health and wellness, it really comes down to the fact we have to start dealing with this at a very young age. kids need to be taught that their future health is going to depend on what they do with kids. Often, as we bring children up, we want to protect them. We want to make sure that their mistakes are mitigated. I had two very different parenting styles when I was growing up. Won't go into my back history, but I had one style that said, "Hey, whatever you did, it's not your fault. It's the fault of conditions. It's the fault of." And then I had another side of my family that said, "You did it, you fixed it." And I actually learned a lot more from the "you did it, you fixed it" side than from the "it's not your fault" side, because that you and my relatives, I could see the two paths in the family. My relatives that came from the no fault side were invariably always in trouble, had multiple marriages, had long-term problems with jobs and careers. And the folks that were on the "you broke it, you fix it" side, they were some of the wealthiest members of and most successful members of the family. And in fact, as I found going through my early life, some of the most beneficial things that happened had nothing to do with school. I was like a lot of people. I had a lot of personal free time, and to keep me from getting into more trouble than I was likely getting into, my grandfather had hired a tutor, and that tutor's job was to teach me about life. And so I went and I saw prisons, I saw mental hospitals, I saw how some of the workers that came across the border illegally lived, and I saw the repercussions that people suffered for doing bad things, and it drove into me this idea that if I wanted a better life, it was my responsibility. It wasn't somebody else's responsibility to give it to me, and then there were steps to get there, and that meant that I had to, as Donald said, I had to make sure that people weren't misleading me. And as a result, I tested as being relatively hard to scam. Just because of the mindset I developed as a child is naturally suspicious. Now, it doesn't mean it can't happen. I've fallen for scammers like everybody else has. Just imagine I've fallen for far fewer of them and caught on far more quickly than I did. But another example, as I got older, we were invested in. We decided we were going to retire in Belize, and we invested in a place called Sanctuary Belize. And we were all excited, like everybody else was excited, and we bought in. And but there was just something about it that bothered me. And so I said, let's just, before we go all in on this thing, let's go down and visit off cycle and see what goes on when people aren't expecting us to be there. And then I concluded that it was a scam. And I was able to bail out and get my money back in return for not telling anybody else that it was a scam, which was kind of ethically obtuse, except for the fact that I published it was a scam. In fact, one of my biggest articles was talking about the fact that it was a huge fraud. And yet the other people that my co-investors came back and attacked me mercilessly for destroying their future. And at the end, it turned out that Sanctuary Belize was the largest fraud that the U.S. government had ever discovered. Hundreds of millions of dollars of fraud, and it was pretty obvious. And yet, when I brought it up, I was able to save myself, but I couldn't save anybody else, because they, rather than looking into it, they said, I was hurting their worldview, and I needed to be stopped. And so in the end, if we teach kids when they're young to understand the fundamentals of data, understand that the validity of data matters, and understand that their life is their responsibility and not somebody else's, not their parents, not their government, and I think we'll naturally have a better world.
Thank you. Professor Edward, what are the concluding remarks for today?
Yeah. Here we go. I thought I was muted there. Just a couple of points. By the way, I posted a link to the Index of Economic Freedom, which was my idea at the Heritage Foundation in the late 1980s and early 90s. I also worked with Milton Friedman, by the way, on a separate report looking at how economic freedom correlates with GDP per capita, economic growth, et cetera. So and one of the interesting things, especially about the Index of Economic Freedom, is it looks at the relationship between government corruption on three indicators at least, and economic growth. So I suggest that you take a look at both of those, and happy to talk to anyone about it. But it's interesting on education. Donald, I think you mentioned Common Core and how they teach. And One of my daughters is using the approaches they take and finds it fine, and the other one is just confused as hell about it. So I have to sit down and say, okay, here's the normal way of doing it. The point is here, as we discussed, as Rob pointed out, you educate the individual, and we're all different, and there are different approaches. And so to me, that's very important. But it also comes back to our discussion about healthcare, about well-being, and so forth. You cure the individual. And so I'm very happy we've had this discussion that has kind of looked around at how not only to make a better system to, for example, encourage young people and old people and everybody else to take care of their own health, to create incentives for people to take care of their own health, to educate them about how to think about their own health, to be entrepreneurs not only of their own economic life, but of their own physical life. And so I think that that's absolutely crucial. And that's why I think that we know about the technology revolution that has allowed us to have this conversation. The technology, communications, information revolutions that have so many people now with smartphones and the like. I'd like to see a similar revolution in education. I'd like to see a similar revolution in healthcare. We talked about life extension and treating aging as a curable condition. And you're going to see more and more of that in the future because of breakthroughs that have been made in the last 5 to 10 years. And that to me is very exciting because it really is going to allow countries, especially that have suffered from healthcare problems, the problems you've just discussed with your father not having access. It's going to literally make the situation easier in the future. So I'm really looking forward to this future, because even though we're in a time of pandemic and so many people are pessimistic, I'm an optimist. And I think that this conversation was very useful, and hopefully it brings out the optimism in your audience about what is possible.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Professor Donald. Thank you,
Can I
Professor
make
Edward.
one teeny
Yes.
point? I just want to say one thing. I've been a teacher for many decades. And good teachers do what Edward was saying. Good teachers identify every person in the class and understand how they're different. And so that's one problem with distance education. Creating curriculum is extremely difficult. So doing it for individual people is beyond what we can do right now. So I just wanted to give a plug for teachers because
Thank you.
they deserve it.
This is our objective. World Talent Economy Forums. Actually, we are trying to reaching millions of people. From my personal life, when I was in Bangladesh, when I moved to Oxford University, I completely, my thought process, my strategy, my activities, everything changed. So I believe the developing nations people, those who get more access with this kind of knowledge, educations, and strategy, they can change themselves. And talent is everywhere. Trust me, I visited many of the remote area in my personal life. So I find many of the talented people from Oxford and people from, example, a remote area student from Malaysia. There is no difference. There are many talents around the world. So we have to connect all of the talents, and we need good mentors like you. The mentors can change human life. Good teachers, good mentors, always helpful for education system. And that's why World Talent Economy Forums, we are distributing our content through the millions of students. And hopefully from the May, we will start our summit and academic activities. So with your contribution, we can change many of the human lives, and we can connect all of the talented people. I'm sure today's content is very valuable for the youth community, very valuable for the Asia Pacific peoples, and this is the way we can grow together. Thank you, Professor Edward. Thank you, Professor Donalds and Mr. Rob, for your valuable advice, guidelines, and continuous support for World Talent Economy Forum. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Take pleasure.
Care. Okay, bye-bye. Take care.
Bye.
Yes, Professor. Yes, you want to add anything?
Can you send me Beth's email address?
Yes, I have to. Yes, I will.
Okay.
Thank you.